We also got talking about the 17th Amendment. Senators used to be appointed, I guess, by the state legislatures, and seems like that provided a lot of check on the federal government by the states, because if the senators screwed up, they knew that the state legislature would yank them back there. And so, the 17th Amendment changed that, where now we elect, senators directly. Mm-hmm. It seems like those two amendments, 16 and 17, both took a big chunk out of federalism.
Well, sir, let me just say this. You're exactly right.
I'm curious what the thought was, or what the impetus was in implementing those,
They became part. We're running out of time. These were part of the progressive movement, and they were also part of a populist movement, particularly when it came to the state. You see, the Constitution doesn't actually prohibit states from holding elections for senators. But the framers absolutely intended that the senators represent the state, the sovereignty of the state. As you know, the federal government, the Constitution is the creation. They are the creation of the states. And there was an enormous amount of debate about Congress. And they discussed Montesquieu, and these were geniuses, these men. They were well-read, well-studied, and they were trying to figure out the best plan, and they were fighting over proportionality versus equal representation. And so we get this bicameral Congress, where the Senate is obviously equal to 2 members from each state. And at least the theory was that the states would be represented in the Senate and the people would be represented in the House of Representatives. Well, obviously that doesn't exist anymore. Can I add one more point, sir, before we go on this issue of federalism generally? The 10th Amendment today is completely ignored. And it is completely ignored by, among others, judges.
Yeah,
and if they would take the time, and if they gave a damn about America's founding, they would research the enormous debates that went on in the state ratifying conventions. Because sir, some states almost pulled the plug. They almost did not ratify the Constitution of the United States. And part of the deal was that after they agreed, the first Congress on its meeting would put together what we call today the Bill of Rights and submit them to the states for ratification. And the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, but the Federalists too, Madison, after fighting George Mason and others on the issue of what we call the Bill of Rights, conceded it, and they had to concede it because they barely won ratification of the Constitution in Massachusetts. John Adams had to do everything humanly possible to get it ratified there because they were concerned to the very damn end that this government not be so powerful and centralized that they were creating, but it be powerful enough but not too powerful, and they wanted to leave everything that wasn't enumerated in there to the states. And now today, the 9th and 10th Amendments, they act like they don't even exist. Thank you for your call, and thank you for bringing that up. And that's the way the leftists have to behave. That's the way those who support big government have to behave. Because if the 9th and 10th Amendments were still in effect, because in practice they don't apply, do they? Obviously they should. Well, then the country wouldn't look like it looks today. We'll be right back. The Bill of Rights, there were actually 12 amendments, but 10 were adopted. The 11th and 12th Amendment proposed to the states became the 9th and the 10th Amendments, which you never hear about or never are taken seriously. If the 9th and 10th Amendments weren't promised at the time of the ratification debates, there would have been no Constitution whatsoever. Let me play Chris Matthews' game. Let's pretend we start a fledgling cable network. Let's call it, just for fun, MSLSD. Every primetime host and the host into the night is white. Just like that restaurant where there are only white customers. Or whites at the counter. So my question to Chris Matthews is, even with the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, why is that over there at MSLSD? That is, Why is every single I'm just using your logic. Do whatever you want. Ron Paul would say, look, you guys, it's your private business. Do what you wish. Your property's protected. It's your private property right, or whoever owns MSLSD, the poor souls that own it, it's their private property right to go broke with it. Fine. But every damn one of the hosts is white. Now, I'm just following your logic, Chris. I get so tired of white liberals playing these games. Now, the guy who runs NBC News, white. The major hosts, white. MSLSD, major hosts, white. And he wants to debate 1964. Well, a lot has happened since 1964. And by the way, the segregation and Jim Crow laws and all the rest, they weren't broken because of some government law. They were stopped because the people came out of their churches, mostly black people, joined by some other people. And they rose up. And they said enough is enough. And through horrible abuse and killings, they prevailed. They changed the country. Not the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Not the 1965 Civil Rights Act. Not the 1970 this act or the 1980. Obviously they helped, but they came later. My point is it was individuals. It was citizens who changed this country. Just like it was individuals, it was citizens who created this country. Now, the problem is we're dealing with extremely ignorant hosts who have a superficial understanding of this country and the philosophy that undergirds it. I hear constantly, and it drives me nuts, that the 3/5 vote in the Constitution was put there by the South to limit blacks so they weren't recognized as human beings. And that's not at all what happened. It was put there by the North to prevent the South from having additional members in the House of Representatives, because the Northern delegates argued you can't have slaves and treat them as non-humans and then demand that we count them as people for purposes of increasing your political clout in the House of Representatives. The first draft of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson's draft, he wrote in there abolishing slavery. A man who owned slaves. We've had this discussion off the air. How can a man who owned slaves do this? Because he was imperfect. In some ways, very seriously imperfect. But for Thomas Jefferson and men like him, this country wouldn't exist. There wouldn't have been a Declaration of Independence. And if there hadn't been a nation with the North joined with the South, there wouldn't have been a civil war. A horrific, horrific war. Over 500,000 killed. And slavery would not have been abolished necessarily in what were those southern colonies, or certainly not all of them. See, these discussions don't work on MSLSD or places like them. You're not given the time to discuss it. You're not given the time to explain it. To have real, substantive debates? No. No. And by the way, Chris, those were Democrats who were the governors, who were the sheriffs, who were the mayors, who were pulling out the hoses and the billy clubs and the guns and the sheets and the nooses and all the rest. That's part of the Democrat Party history, as well as the good part. It's also part of the bad part. Don't try and lay that on Newt Gingrich. No. That's your party. In a famous clause, and I'm going to stop this, but I love this stuff. As Digital History points out, a famous clause that was ultimately deleted from the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson cited the African slave trade as one of the examples of British oppression. This was my point. Jefferson refers to the English government's repeated vetoes of attempts by colonial legislatures to restrict or halt the importation of slaves as one of the reasons justifying revolution. That's what I was talking about. That was taken out by the Continental Congress on the whole. Virginia especially had profited from a great natural increase in its slave population and had no desire for further slave surplus, but there was a huge debate of conscience going on, even before the Revolution in 76. Really started to take hold in 1773. And it was part of the debate before the Revolution, during the Revolution, after the Revolution, at the Constitutional Convention, in the ratifying conventions in the states. And they did the best they could do at the time, given the history of the colonies. And the point is that if there wasn't a United States, there would have still been colonies. And if there had still been colonies, slavery, in my humble opinion, in a number of these colonies would have continued well after the end of what now was the Civil War, 1865. So it's too easy to dismiss what these men did and tried to do in pulling this group of colonies together after a revolution. The Constitution does not promote slavery. I've heard people say that. No, it doesn't. Where? The Constitution does not promote slavery. And it provides a date certain for the ending of the importation of slaves. And by the way, Britain, very nefariously, was doing everything it could to maintain the slave trade in the United States because it was making a lot of money from it. In any event, these issues have a lot of history and a lot of facts that the very, very white hosts at MSLSD never want to get into. We'll be right back. All right. So I'll have people say, well, he didn't, Jefferson, flat out urge the abolition of slavery. But that's what he was saying. That if states want to abolish it, the British government was imposing its will. The other thing you have to keep in mind, the man who had the most influence on Jefferson, certainly when he was writing the Declaration, was John Locke. John Locke was vehemently opposed to slavery. Inalienable rights, he called them unalienable rights that wound up in the Declaration. He rejected slavery, and he wrote about that. And that was probably, certainly, if not the, one of the most influential philosophers to Jefferson. One of the most influential philosophers at the Constitutional Convention. Locke became less so, although his views obviously were very, very important, was Montesquieu. And he wrote at length, and he objected to slavery too. You're talking about men who were writing, in the case of Locke, 1600s, died in the early 1700s. Montesquieu writing The Spirit of the Laws, 1750 or thereabouts. And these were the people, among others, the Scottish Enlightenment, the French Enlightenment, these were the people that our founders were reading. At least many of them. And you know, Lincoln used to refer to the Declaration of Independence all the time during the Civil War. When people used to say, you know, what the hell, what kind of country is this? You know, Slahey said, you read that Declaration of Independence. It puts in place a set of principles by which this society is bound. And while they couldn't overcome all of their issues at the time they were creating this nation, they put in place a document, the Declaration of Independence, for posterity, for the future, so their children and their grandchildren could correct what needed to be corrected. I'll be right back. One, not to overdo this, but to be accurate. And then I'll move on, I promise. First draft of the Declaration. Here's the sentence, among others, that Jefferson had in there that was removed at the request of delegates from South Carolina and Georgia. Remember, Jefferson being from Virginia, a slave state. Quote, meaning the British government, the British Crown, he has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. As I said at the time, they were having a problem with the British, who were heavily promoting slavery in the colonies as a way to make money while doing away with it themselves. That was stripped out of the final version. But the final version still covered all human beings, which is Lincoln's point. Final version covers everybody. We all have unalienable rights. And so his point, and my point, based on his point and others, looking back, is that once the Declaration of Independence became the founding document for this society, slavery at some point had to be ended. Otherwise, the Declaration doesn't make any sense. Lincoln's point, too. And Lincoln believed, and I believe, and there's historical support for this, that even those who owned slaves, George Mason refused, for among other reasons, to sign on the Constitution from Virginia. Because not only did he believe in a Bill of Rights like the Virginia Declaration of Rights, it didn't abolish slavery. So I'm not trying to make excuses. I'm telling you our history. History of a great nation. That this issue was fought over, this issue was debated, there were attempts to address it, and that in the end, the Declaration of Independence, as Lincoln would point out over and over and over again, compelled this nation to end slavery.